Daniel C. in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Daniel.
Shalom Aleichem, my friend.
I appreciate it. Go for it.
I had a question for you regarding the left's almost promotion of these riots. Not so much the protests. I definitely separate the protesters from the rioters. I think protesting is one of the beautiful rights we have in this country, and I encourage it. But I am almost curious. They're promoting these riots now. I wonder if they were able to implement their socialist utopia, if they would feel the same about rioting at that point. I think I know the answer to that, but I want to hear your thoughts. Also, what do you think would be different if they were able to enact their socialist utopia? What do you think they would do differently when it comes to riots and protesting?
Well, I mean, if they were able to enact their socialist utopia, they'd run over the rioters and the protesters with tanks. I mean, isn't that what happens in socialist utopias? Right? Tiananmen Square didn't happen in a capitalist-free country. It happened in a communist country. The fact is that socialism is all fun and games until somebody decides they don't like the system, at which point the state runs directly over them. Socialist countries are not exactly famous for their tolerance of public protest. And I'm not talking about capitalist countries like Norway. I'm talking about full-on socialist countries like the ones that the hard left actually espouses, the Venezuelas of the world. They're not really fond of counter-protesting. Again, you can see, by the way, you can see this in how they've been treating, in a soft way, the anti-lockdown protests. But if you're an anti-lockdown protester, they've been using the full force and weight of the government to shut you down and try to prosecute you. If you go and try and open your business today in New Jersey, Phil Murphy will come to your business and shut you down. If you try to do a minion in New York City, Bill de Blasio will show up pounding on your door. But if you're out there by the tens of thousands marching and shouting George Floyd's name and spitting all over each other, then it's fully okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's fairly obvious that if you protest in a way the socialists don't like, they are perfectly happy to use all the government power to shut you down. And if you protest in a way they do like, they're perfectly willing to waive basic common sense and decency in order to let you do it. It's pretty incredible. Daniel, really appreciate the call. Brad in Dallas, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Brad.
Hey, Ben, I got a question about abortion. So I consider myself a conservative, and I would think that if you're for smaller government and the government having less power, then wouldn't you want the government to not be able to tell you whether you could or could not abort your unborn baby, regardless of the moral and ethical implications of it? Thanks.
And the basic answer here, Brad, is no, because the fundamental idea of conservatism and even libertarianism is that the government does have a role in protecting human life. And so the question is what the definition of human life is. If you believe that that's a human life in the womb, then the government has a role in protecting that human life, just as the government would have a role in protecting you from being shot in the face, right? The government would have a role in protecting you at the 9-month in your mother's room, in your mother's womb, from being chopped apart and sucked into a sink. That is the basic libertarian and conservative idea on abortion. Brad, appreciate the call. John in New York, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, John.
Hey, Ben. So my question has to do with convincing people to change their mind. I'm sure you know one of the hardest parts of being a conservative is convincing someone on the left to change their mind. I mean, that's kind of the point of the movie Inception, correct? They need to have an awakening moment and come to this agreement with themselves in order to believe the information that you are exposing to them. So my question for you is that if you were in a position, let's say one day you were the future president, or in a position where the left-wing media had to pay attention to you and would listen to what you had to say, how would you go about changing your message so that people would actually research the facts and try to learn for themselves to change their own opinion, instead of just sharing all these gotcha videos on Facebook that never actually get anything done, because all you're really doing is sharing those videos with your friends that share the same opinions as you. And the people that need to see those videos never actually get to see them.
Yeah, I mean, John, I think there's a lot to that on social media. I mean, social media tends to be a place of silos, and I don't think social media is where you tend to convince people. You tend to convince people in face-to-face conversations. And the way that you convince people is by starting from shared premises. So very often, people start from sort of the wrong level of the conversation. So if you start, let's take this whole protest situation as an example. If you start from the premise, we all agree police brutality and racism are bad. And now the question is, do you think that defunding the police is a good idea? Well, we're starting from the idea that police brutality and racism are bad and that we don't want black people to die. Now we can have a conversation about the ramifications of what you're talking about. But what people like to do is they have an argument about a very divisive policy because they don't want to have the argument at the underlying level, right? Because they actually want to exacerbate the disagreement. So you have to start from shared premises, and then you can sort of have a decent conversation because the baseline assumption is that we're all decent people here. We all sort of agree on the fundamentals. If you don't agree on the fundamentals, by the way, then it's possible you can't convince anybody and the conversation is over. But it's good to know that right at the outset. John, appreciate the call. Ian in Oregon, you're on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, Ian.
I have two questions regarding current events, sort of from a legal standpoint. The first one is, in Georgia, it appears that the gentleman who fired the last shot used a racial epithet after he shot him. Do you think manslaughter is off the table now?
I think that it is unlikely that they will charge. I mean, I believe they've already charged them with murder. I think that manslaughter is probably off the table because, again, the level of premeditation required. There's a theory of felony murder. He was committing a felony and trying to apprehend somebody who had not committed a crime. So it's kidnapping. So if you kill somebody in the middle of a kidnapping, then that's a felony murder. It could theoretically be a manslaughter, as you say. Once you use the racial epithet, then it looks a lot like you were stalking this guy to at least try and stop him with the gun on a racial basis. Murder charges are definitely on the table there. I think that manslaughter is a very unlikely charge there. I think manslaughter, frankly, is a better charge in the case of Derek Chauvin, based on sort of split autopsies and the fact that it doesn't appear he was trying to kill George Floyd. He was doing something wrong. He was doing something brutal, but I don't think that he wanted George Floyd to die. I don't see a lot of evidence of that. But again, we'll see what a jury is willing to decide on that. I think manslaughter best fits the description in that particular case, but that's not the way the prosecutors are going. Appreciate the call. David in Hollister, California, on the Ben Shapiro Show. Go for it, David.
Question here. So with obviously what's going on right now, the big thing is defunding the police. And with the defunding of the police, what is your opinion, or what do you think is going to be the next steps after they defund the police? Who's going to be picking up the 911 calls? Who's going to be doing the investigations of any type of cases?
Yeah, David, they have no idea. David, I appreciate the call. They literally have no idea. I mean, spokespeople from Minneapolis were asked this question, and they said that they need to check their privilege if they're worried about it. The answer is they have no idea, because again, this is just virtue signaling bullcrap. That's all this is. All righty, we'll continue to bring you the latest in a chaotic and unfolding time. You're listening to The Ben Shapiro Show.